What is biblical justice? And what are biblical justice resources? These are fair questions that I would expect from anyone approaching this podcast for the first time, but they're questions I can only begin to answer today. If I can, I'll start with the question about resources first. The Biblical Justice Resources Project began as a series of resource lists available online for people interested in learning about a biblical understanding of justice. These lists still form the backbone of biblicaljusticeresources.com and continue to grow today. Now, the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast is another place where you will be able to learn about biblical justice. We'll be able to cover a breadth of ideas, topics, and social issues throughout the life of this podcast, but I wanted to use these first few episodes to help answer our first question from earlier, as individuals from different fields help us define biblical justice. We'll see how biblical justice is learned, how it's taught, and just how integral it is to Christian discipleship. To that end, I wanted to begin by looking at the church to better understand the relationship between justice and discipleship. I couldn't think of a better place to start than right at home for me with the pastor of my church, Edrin Williams. Pastor Edrin Williams has been the lead pastor of the Sanctuary Covenant Church in Minneapolis for 6 years and has been on staff at the sanctuary for 14 years. You'll learn more during our conversation about his early life in South Carolina and his move to Minnesota, his call to ministry, and his leadership of the Black-led, Black-centered, multi-ethnic congregation that worships at Sanctuary. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Pastor Edrin Williams. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources Podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Pastor Edrin, thank you for joining me here for this conversation today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eric.
So I want to start off, this is probably going to end up being a pretty large question to ask right off the bat, but kind of the way I want to structure our conversations with this first couple episodes is thinking about how we're defining biblical justice. Mm-hmm. And so I've heard you say from the pulpit that people around the Twin Cities will say that Sanctuary is the social justice church, and that you would correct them and say that it's the biblical justice church. So I'm seeing three kind of pieces to that, and maybe to start off with the first two, how do you define biblical justice, and how does that look different from social justice?
Yeah, it's good to know you're paying attention when I'm when I'm saying stuff from the stage. It helps hold me accountable. Let me first say though, before we jump in, thanks for having me, man, and I'm excited to be a part of this podcast and your ongoing journey of learning and growing, and then creating resources for people. I think it's really cool, and so thank you for letting me be a part of that.
Yeah, for sure.
To the specific question of how I would define biblical justice and what, if anything, differentiates it from social justice. I'll start broadly. When I think about justice, and when I think about Sanctuary and the work we do and the history and the journey we've been on as a church for now 22 years, I think about my own story of how my growth journey, faith in Jesus, intersects with Sanctuaries and what drew me here. The most basic definition I could give of justice is of God's work of making right what is wrong in the world. As a Christian, I have this sort of meta narrative story of the history of creation and our journey in the world of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, and I see justice as God's work over time to undo the brokenness that is evident in our world in big, audacious, far-reaching ways, but also in the small, practical, day-to-day ways in which things are simply not the way God intended them to be in the world. And when I think about God's work of intervening in the course of human history to make those wrongs right, that's how I think about justice. And so for me, justice is not strictly punitive. Justice is not revenge. Justice is not taking one group of people off top and putting another group of people there. It's not replacement theory, as you might hear in some other race conversations or that happen in society. Justice really is God's ongoing work of making right what's wrong in the world. And I use the expression very regularly and intentionally of biblical justice because I believe God's word, the Bible, is our guide for knowing how justice should happen. What is the brokenness that we're talking about God needing to restore? What are the ways that God has already, through his word, given us an assurance that he would restore these things? And then what is our part as Christians, as the church, in joining with God in that work in the world? And so justice is, in many ways, a part of salvation history for me. Like when I think of uh, Jesus coming into the world and then pointing to the kingdom that is to come, I see justice work involved in creating that coming kingdom and bearing witness even now to the things that will be forever and ever and ever. Amen. When Christ returns, and so justice is both huge. It's also very small. It is making sure that the poor and the widow and the orphan and the stranger are cared for and not preyed upon or not cast out. I think all those are acts of justice. And I think when we look at the Bible, we see clear instruction around all those things. And the question is always, how do we live into that as a church, as the church in real time today, like with real people and with real laws and real administrations? What does it mean to live that out today? The difference, if there's any like pronounced difference between this idea of biblical justice and social justice, I I, I want to be careful to say, um, for me, biblical justice is guided directly by um, our understanding of God's word. Like we are for all the things that God is for, and the things that fall short of God's best for us, uh, we don't affirm those things. And so, um, one of the separations or points of divergence is that this idea of social justice in our world today has gone beyond the idea of racial justice. It's gone beyond class justice. It's gone beyond environmental justice, and it also includes things like views on human sexuality, and it's often packaged as a one for all. Like if you are committed to social justice, you must be committed to all these things. And I think there's a way in which Christians can and should be nuanced in what we mean and say when we talk about justice. And so I am called to be loving and caring and supportive and compassionate towards all people, but that does not mean I need to affirm everything that the world says needs to be affirmed. And even if I don't affirm something, it does not give me permission to oppress um, or to cast out. I think it actually calls me to the work, to that crucial work of living in that tension of affirming what God affirms, and also caring for all people, which is hard work. It's difficult work. It is work that really requires the work of the Holy Spirit, but I think it's the work we're called to.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And then you've kind of bumped up a little bit on this now too, of if this is all a part of we're pulling this out of the Bible. This is part of our Christian faith. Then coming back to that, we are a biblical justice church. What does it look like to do that as the church? How do we think of that individually, corporately, and then maybe also like not just individual churches, but then like the broader church as a whole? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it is a first and foremost, and I'll put my discipleship hat on here. I think the most important piece, or one of the first things that comes to mind for me, is it means if this is a biblical matter and not just a social matter, it means that we have to look at our discipleship and ask, what is it like? How are we teaching people to engage with the scriptures in such a way that they might be able to look at it with a justice lens? Because I realize, and I say this now, and having 20 years of ministry under my belt, it is possible for two people to look at the very same passage of scripture, and one person see a very traditional, abstract story that points to something about God, and then is also sort of wrapped up in a nice bow to teach us like 3 moral lessons for how we live our life today. And then somebody else could look at that passage and see a very clear way in which this points to God's heart for X, Y, and Z, and trace that theme throughout all of the scripture, and therefore feel if we are the church today, that if God cares about this, we ought to care about it as well. I grew up in, and you being here at Sanctuary, you know that you've heard this a million times. I grew up in South Carolina, down in the Low Country, small town not far from Charleston, South Carolina. So the place where the Civil War, the first shots of the Civil War were fired, or at Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, and so that's the context out of which I come, with that racial history and that historical sort of backdrop. I grew up in a small Black Baptist church, and so I am, in many ways, I joke, even though I pastor a covenant church, that I'm a Baptist missionary to the covenant church, and so I take the scriptures seriously. And when I look at the Bible as I was discipled as a kid to read the scriptures and interpret the scriptures, there is for me a very clear thread throughout all of the scriptures of the power of God to liberate God's people. Starting at Genesis, all throughout the Old Testament, coming into the New Testament, where Jesus is himself the chief liberator. Like, and then you work your way to the book of Revelation, where that is the final act of liberation and God's kingdom comes to bear here on earth. I read the Bible through a justice lens. Everything has some implication for that for me. And I realize now, and I'm realizing it more and more, that is not everybody's experience culturally, even for some people who grew up in, who themselves are Black, and who, for one reason or another, didn't grow up in Black churches or grew up in different kinds of churches. This not like a common, or it's not guaranteed that everybody can look at passages and come to see that same thread throughout the Bible. And so part of my work as a pastor is to work alongside our team here at the church to try to find ways, both big ways and small, subtle ways, to help people be able to read and interpret the Bible in such a way that they see God's liberation work in all of the scriptures. I think there's a unique opportunity that we have as a multi-ethnic church, in that we both have in the room people who are ethnic minorities who come from a history of oppression and suppression and struggle, and we have in the room people who themselves are who are part of the ethnic majority, who they have no or little background in understanding the Bible that way. And um, both the opportunity and the challenge for me is to bring the word of God to both those groups and everybody in between, so that each of us can be both encouraged and challenged to take that next step in our growth. And that's hard work, Eric.
Yeah.
Like and anybody who would tell you it's easy to do what we're trying to do as a church, probably is either lying to you or they're doing a terrible job at it and they think they're doing a good job. Like it is you're speaking to multiple groups all at the same time. And so you're multilingual in a real sense in trying to do that work. And so it has to be woven into your discipleship. It has to be woven into how you're helping people to learn to read the Bible. It has to be rooted in the Bible. And so when you're here at Sanctuary, we're encouraging people, bring your Bibles, take notes, wrestle with this stuff. Don't just take my word for it. I say this from the pulpit, and I absolutely mean it, for people to be challenged to grow in their understanding of the scriptures and to be open to a new way of understanding the Bible. When I think about the broader church and what it looks for us to, if justice is a biblical concept and it is God's idea before it was our idea, what does it mean for the big church? I think one of the practical things it means is that churches like Sanctuary need and are made stronger by partnerships and relationships with other churches who are doing similar kind of ministry, because we can learn from each other, we can share resources, we can share learnings, we can encourage one another. There aren't, in my opinion, enough leaders and pastors of churches like ours. And so one of my own personal desires as I look towards the future of my ministry is I really do want to commit what I would consider to be the last stage of my ministry. I think I'm in about phase 2 of or 3, and I think quarter 3 and 4 of my ministry will be specifically equipping people to do the kind of ministry that we do here, raising up leaders specifically to serve in multi-ethnic, urban, justice-minded churches, because there just simply, in my opinion, aren't enough people committed to this work or trained to do this work well. And I just want to pour myself out doing that, because I think I've learned some things over these 20 years. I'm still learning today. I'm very excited about the work still, and I just want to invest that learning back into others. And so that's why I say yes to things like this, because I think it could be very helpful to help continue to grow people.
Yeah, that's really good, really important, I think. And
Yeah.
if we don't have time to come back to that in this episode, we might have to have you back on to think about what that might look
Yeah,
like in the future on a future
for
episode.
sure.
But I want to
For sure.
come back to something real quick that sort of has been surrounding this conversation so far, and that I think, in my sort of personal opinion, well, I think broadly we can see there's been sort of a conflation between what we think of theologically and what we think of politically. And so when we think of using terms like conservative or progressive, those two things are maybe not supposed to mix together that the way that they in the way that they have been so far.
Yeah.
But when I think of conservative theology, a lot of that I feel like is founded on we are going back to the Bible. And so that's where I've told people at times things that look like in our country today should be politically liberal or politically progressive. A lot of times I feel like they're biblically or theologically conservative, because if we're talking about caring for the poor, for the vulnerable, or things like that, those are things that people can think of, I think, more often in our country as politically progressive, but theologically,
Right.
I feel like they're coming out straight out of the Bible. And so, if
Right.
God is concerned about them, we as if you're conservative, theologically conservative, that's a thing I think that you should be caring about.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the beauty of it, Eric, that some of these labels that we have for people and groups and ideologies, they actually don't work very well because, like you said, like something could be considered woke and liberal and leftist, and you literally can go to the Bible and see God commanding his people, calling his people to that very thing, and not like one time and then
Yeah.
forgetting it over and over again. Like you look at the Old Testament, Israel is given clear instruction of how to treat the poor and the stranger and those kind of things. And even Israel's own history has them being the oppressed and God liberating them. And so if you're talking about like bringing people out of poverty or helping people to affirm their dignity and knowing their value in God, those aren't like leftist political inventions. Those are things that are in this Bible that we as Christians are called to not just read, but also personal, like internalize and live out. And so the categories don't work very well for us. I think it is that is one of the strengths of like continuing to use a word or an expression like biblical justice, because we are not just out here making up stuff. like
Right.
like
Right.
like it comes from someplace and it's affirmed by someplace, and because it is a biblical concept first, I also think that can give those of us who are doing this work, it can give us encouragement and comfort in the course of doing the work, which is very hard work, and you get a lot of criticism for approaching the work that the way that we do. But on my toughest days, when it seems like, man, we're just running into walls, and this idea of bringing people together across race and class and all these other social barriers, like there are times where it feels like, man, it would just be good to have an easy ministry journey. I'm reminded, like, this is God's call to God's people, and sure, I could go and find some place where it would be easier and simpler to do this thing or that thing. But ultimately, I think all churches in some ways are called to figure out what biblical justice looks like in their context. And so even if it's a small white church in rural Minnesota, or it's an all black church here in the Twin Cities, this idea of what does God require of us as God is making right what's wrong in the world, all of us have a part to play in that. And all of us don't aren't called to do the very same thing. And so what works here at Sanctuary and what we're trying to do here at Sanctuary might not be the same work that another congregation is called to do, but I think all of us are called to be involved in the work.
Yeah, for sure. And that I think speaks a little bit to an idea that all ministry is contextual.
Right.
And
Right.
kind of turning that to think about your context as you as an individual. So I know that you're from South Carolina. I know that now you're in Minneapolis. I don't actually know how that transition happened, you coming from South Carolina to Minneapolis. So how did you end up on the north side of Minneapolis?
Yeah. My wife Shaniqua and I have been married for almost 20 years now. It's 19 years actually. We met in college at the University of South Carolina. I we fell in love. I fell in love with her first. And when I'm a year ahead of her in school, so when I graduated, I started working on a master's degree in history. And she came to Minnesota the following year for an internship for, she has a business background. And a company whose corporate office is here in the Twin Cities brought her here for an internship and offered her a position after graduation. And so we moved here for her job first and foremost. A lot of people assume it's like we moved here for me for ministry, but I was at that time still running from my call to ministry. I had felt called to ministry at 17, but I hid it from everybody, my family, my friends, because I was a freshman in college, and for the first time I had freedom in my life, and I was like, I don't want to go into ministry right now. Like, I want to enjoy this freedom. And God gave me some grace and a little bit of rope, but shortly after we moved here to Minnesota, um, that urge and that calling like bubbled up in me again. And so we were attending a church here in the Twin Cities, a large Baptist church, not far from Sanctuary, actually. And I sat with the pastor and shared that I felt God was calling me to ministry, and he sort of walked me through the journey. And um, a couple months later, I came on staff there doing youth ministry in the church, and went to seminary while I was there. Ended up staying there for about 6 years. And then I'd have relationships with some of the staff here at Sanctuary, including the founding pastor, Pastor Efrem, who later would become a fraternity brother of mine. And when I finished seminary, or while I was in seminary, near the end of it, I really had this clear sense that God was calling me to multi-ethnic ministry. And so I looked around the Twin Cities and wondered, where could I learn what it means to actually disciple a multicultural group of people? What does it mean? What does it look like in real time? I don't want to hear the theory anymore. I've read many of the books. I want to see day to day, what does this look like? And Sanctuary was doing it better than anybody, in my opinion. And so I came on as their youth pastor with the intention to be here about 3 years and then go off and plant a church. Like, I don't know if it would be like an extension of Sanctuary or something just similar in mission, but I had a clear plan, Eric. I was going to be here 3 years, and then I was going to go plant. Um, Next month, we'll celebrate 14 years on staff here at Sanctuary, 6 years as the lead pastor. And so I did 3 and a few more, and I'm still here, still learning, still trying to get a sense of like what this work requires. And every season it feels like it requires something a little bit different, because the work that we're doing in biblical justice, while it is indeed rooted in God's word, and clearly there's some principles and ways of doing it, because it is contextual. Context is not just about the location. Context is also about what's happening in the world around you. And so when we came to Sanctuary in 2011, that was during the Barack Obama era, and it was actually cool for all things multi-ethnic at that time. And people were actually saying, we're in a post-racial society, and so we're this great melting pot, and everybody's just coming together. And it was really cool to be a part of a multi-ethnic church around those times. They were popping up everywhere. And then 2016 hit, and the election of Donald Trump the first time around. And it was really a moment of crisis for the evangelical church in the US, because some 70+% of the church voted for this man whose life and his work didn't reflect the ways of Jesus. But so it became a tension point. And what we saw in Sanctuary was that there were a great number of young Christians, particularly young white evangelical Christians, who had grown up in traditional evangelical spaces, who for the first time began to wrestle with like, what actually is our faith about? Because this idea that to be Christian is to be Republican, to be conservative politically, like, we got to ask some hard questions about it based on what we're seeing in the national moment. And so when you look at our church, in 2016, we had a huge influx of young white families who were disenchanted in some ways with the traditional evangelical church, wanted to find something different, but found in a place like Sanctuary still a deep commitment to the Bible, a desire to not only like have head knowledge, but to understand head, heart, and hand together. What does it mean to live this out? And then we saw the same thing in 2020, in the pandemic, as George Floyd was murdered in the city. We saw, like, again, a huge growth in people looking for something beyond what they had sort of spent time in traditional evangelical churches, because many of those churches did not have a response to what was happening in the world around them. Whether it is from a a perspective of compassion, mercy, and justice, or social things related to like police reform and those kind of movements, the global movement for justice. Many churches, like traditional evangelical churches, just didn't have anything in mind for that. In fact, many of them criticized those moments and people's response in those moments. And so our church actually grew in the pandemic and grew during the global uprisings, because not because we shifted and tried to do something different, but just because of who we are and how we like have had this biblical justice frame from the beginning. Many people found solace in that, and so we have continued to grow, and that is a great thing, and it is also a huge responsibility to continue to disciple people, many of whom, like, these concepts of biblical justice is brand new. And so that is the work we're trying to figure out how to do and do well here and now, how to disciple people, some who are brand new to the movement and the work, and some who are farther along and may not have as much patience with the newbies and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah, and that may or may not be an aspect of it being a multi-ethnic, multicultural church. Just, but I think in any place you could potentially say there are going to be people in different places on
for
a
sure.
journey. What does it look like then? What have you seen as being effective ways of both starting to introduce people to these ideas and continuing to feed people who are already quote unquote on board with the mission then?
Right. Yeah. I think some of the things that really help a church like ours, and I would say other churches who do similar work, but also just movements in general. Like, movements are built around culture, and culture is built around things like language and story, shared time together, um, sharing milestones, going through experiences together. And so those are all things that when you really pull back the curtain here at Sanctuary, you see us living into those values and weaving those values into the life of the church. Um, for me in my preaching, I try to use a lot of story, because I think story is one of the ways that you can take these big hard concepts and make them real for people. And so there's a lot of story that we use at various periods of the history of our church. We've included like testimony time in the worship service, because that again is another way of including story. We actually, for a period in our church, had something called The Story, which was sort of you're familiar with The Moth, that show on NPR, the
Uh,
storytelling.
I'm not actually, but
Okay,
I'm
look
sure
it up.
people
Look it
listening
up.
are.
I think you would like it, Eric. So The Moth is the short version. So it's an event that you would host where, say, you would come up and tell a little bit of your story as it relates to some theme for the night. And so, me telling my story of being from South Carolina and the context of growing up in the sort of the shadows of the start of the Civil War, and how that has shaped me as a person and as a pastor. I would get up and share something about that for 10 minutes, and then somebody else would get up and share their story growing up in Iowa, and um, feeling in some ways unprepared when they got to the Twin Cities and saw all these different like, I'm just making up stuff right now, so Iowa people don't be mad at me at all. But that just an example. It is creating space for people to share their story, because story is incredibly powerful in breaking down some of the barriers that we have across culture, and those kind of things. Uh, Creating opportunities for people to eat together and just be involved in each other's lives beyond a Sunday service. Those are all things that have been helpful. When you look at the history of Sanctuary over the 22 years, there have been times where we've done fellowship meal groups, where it's not a life group. It is literally groups of people who meet regularly to share food and time together. And it's like, you're not sneaking a Bible study in at the end. It literally is about connecting over food and time together. And it will, of course, lead to other things where people will study the Bible together and attend church together and pray for each other as they're becoming more and more aware of each other. But it's those kind of small things that I think other people in other walks of life know how to do community well. And even though churches are literally built around building community, like we struggle to know how to do it. And so we've just learned a few things over the years. And again, depending on what's going on in the world at the time, we may shift the program, do it a different way here and there. Um, so the programs can change, but the mission and the vision all stay the same. And that's been helpful for us here as a church.
Yeah. And then part of that vision too is a very intentional, like it's stated as part of the vision, I guess, or whichever you know the phrasing better than I do, but that
Right.
along with being, it's not just, Sanctuary is not just a multi-ethnic or multiracial church, it's Black led and Black centered. What does
Yeah.
it mean for Sanctuary to be Black led and Black centered as a multi-ethnic church?
Yeah. Yep. And that's a beautiful a beautiful vision that I would say that predates me. So Pastor Efrem Smith um was the founder of Sanctuary in 2003. And in the founding papers of Sanctuary, as he was sharing this vision that God had given him for this church that was to be, he he got to a part of the founding papers where he wrote about like this community that we're specifically called to, North Minneapolis first. He talked about some of the the unique challenges for African American people in this community. And as he laid out, like, here's some of the unique issues that face African Americans here in North Minneapolis. He said something to the effect of, Sanctuary Covenant Church will be a church for all people of like every background, but it will also be an unapologetically a church that has an intentional strategy for the empowerment of Black people. And I think he said African American people at the time. And so over the years, we've tried different things to capture the heart of that. For me, I love words, and so as over the last few years, I've actually coined that phrase "Black led, Black centered, multi ethnic" to really represent the heart of what Pastor Efrem was going after there. Like, this truly is a multi ethnic church. Um, Everybody is welcomed here at Sanctuary, and at the same time, because of where we are here in North Minneapolis and its history for Black Minnesotans here in this state, we feel particularly called to center the needs, the experiences, and the journey of African Americans, not to the um, exclusion of others, but as a way forward for all of us. And so that means practically that we draw from the rich history and tradition and story of the Black church. When you look at both our style of music, when you look at styles of preaching, when you look at the fact that we every moment of the service is not like scripted down to the T. Like, we allow room for free expression, for the Holy Spirit to move. We might take a song that is the recorded version is 3 minutes, and we'll do it for 7 minutes because you're doing call and response. All those things matter to who we are, and they make us unique even among multi-ethnic churches. And the reality is, Eric, even for churches across the nation that are multi-ethnic, um, the majority of them are still pastored by white men. And
Yeah.
so the culture of that church, even though you look at the congregation and you take a picture, it will look multi-ethnic. In many cases, the culture of those churches are more aligned with uh, sort of white normativity. And so what time looks like and what the order of the service looks like and the preaching style, what it looks like and what is valued, what is considered good, what is considered normal. Those things are sometimes like you can't tell the difference between that multi-ethnic church and an all-white church. And we are not just to push against that, but we're saying that the Black Christian tradition has something rich to offer us. And here at Sanctuary, we want to learn from them. We're not pretending to be a Black church because we're not a Black church. And anybody who's ever been to a Black church knows that Sanctuary is not a Black church. The fact that I can tell you by 9:30, by 10:30, we'll start at 9 and we'll be done at 10:30. You can't do that in a Black church. We start on a certain time and you'll end when the Spirit is done moving. And so there are just some ways in which we're not like a traditional Black church, but we learn from, draw from the values and the traditions of the Black Christian tradition. There is a reality also that even our non-Black staff members have to be willing to learn, and not necessarily master, and certainly not to mimic, but to learn from the values and precepts of the Black Christian experience. And so we've tried a number of things over the years. Right now, we have 2 team members who are a part of a experience created by a denomination where they get to, in many ways, study. It's an anti-racism discipleship pathway where they are, in their own way, learning to develop that lens of how to look at the Bible and how to think about ministry and church and people and community from not just the white lens that they grew up in, but from an anti-racist lens. And so it takes opportunities like that and experiences like that for us to help bring along members who didn't grow up in Black church traditions or for whom some of this stuff is new. If we're going to bring them on our team, we want to also expose them to resources and opportunities to grow in their understanding, because ultimately every staff person is responsible not to just do all the work of the church, but to help equip the church for living this stuff out themselves. And so how do I expect my team to bring the congregation along in things that they themselves aren't versed in? And so it is really, if you come on staff as a white person, if you come on staff as an Asian American person, if you come on staff as a Latino American person, if you grew up overseas, there is an expectation that you are learning from the rich history of the Black church, not again to mimic it, but so that it can help inform how you lead and serve. And I think it is meaningful work, and it helps us to do what can otherwise seem like an impossible work at times.
Yeah. I want to come back to thinking about that a little bit, but I also know that we've mentioned North Minneapolis a couple times here, and that people who are not in Minneapolis or not in Minnesota may not understand what the context of North Minneapolis is. So I know I didn't prep you on this at all,
but
what is just sort of a brief overview of what is North Minneapolis? How is it different from the rest of Minneapolis or from the rest of the area?
Yeah. So I often tell people when I travel places and to talk about Sanctuary's work, I tell people that North Minneapolis is very much, I would say, the heart and soul of Minneapolis. It's not the only Black enclave in the city of Minneapolis, but it is one of the most unique. When you look at the Twin Cities, North Minneapolis, parts of South Minneapolis, certainly parts of St. Paul as well, have huge and historic Black communities, and all have made significant contributions to the Twin Cities life and history. when I think of North Minneapolis, I think of south side of Chicago. I think of west side of Chicago. I think of Baltimore. I think of the east side of Atlanta. And so there is this juxtaposition of beauty and struggle all at the same time, where there's culture, there's music, there's community, there's food, there's churches, there's incredible organizations who are doing community-based work. There's I said music. There's more music. There's just this richness of city life. Like all the beautiful things about the city you can find in North Minneapolis. It is a wonderful place to be, and at the same time, it is a place that has faced many challenges, um, politically and economically. And so you'll find high rates of poverty, um, high rates of violence at times. You'll find underperforming schools. I would say schools that have been underinvested in. You'll find a food deserts at times. Like we have one full service grocery store that is right across the street from our church, that was damaged in the uprisings post George Floyd's murder. And so for a time in our city, in our community, there was no full service grocery store in our community. And so that allowed for our church to sort of step in and provide some resources for people. But the community felt the sting of that when for almost a year, if not longer, there was no full service grocery store. And people had to drive or take buses to other parts of the Twin Cities to get their basic groceries and that kind of stuff. And so it is this beautiful and at times hard place. But I can't imagine, Eric, sanctuary existing in any other part of the Twin Cities. And by that, I mean, like, as a church grows, particularly a multi-ethnic church that gets to the size that our church has, there is always the temptation to move out to the suburbs, find a place where you can build a bigger building with better parking and attract more people of a particular socioeconomic class. And Sanctuary has had that temptation over the years as it grew very fast in the beginning. And the church people encouraged Sanctuary to move out to a first ring suburb and like just build something beautiful. And you can still love the city and serve the city from out there. But Pastor Efrem and later Pastor Dennis and then myself, we believe a part of what God has given us in Sanctuary is a church that is not just for the city, but is in the city and of the city. And so we're not moving out to the burbs. We encourage our brothers and sisters who live out in the burbs to come in and be a part of what we're doing. And we see a lot of that. We see people coming from all over the Twin Cities to be a part of this church. And so when I talk about North Minneapolis, it really is this place of a whole lot of beauty, a whole lot of struggle, and it is the place to which God has called our church. And I'm excited for us to be here and rooted in this community.
Yeah. Then thinking about people in the church interacting with the community then, and thinking about how you were helping to maybe you not individually are bridging that gap, but helping people to understand how do we make that happen. There's obviously, with it being multicultural, multi-ethnic, and I remember being at one of the annual meetings and you having like a bunch of chairs laid out and you're like, this is like representative of all the different demographic groups spread all over the cities. We're all different sorts of people. What does it look like to resource members of the church, one, to understand biblical justice, but then two, to bring that into their interactions in the community? So I know, for example, you've talked about the covenant experience with the staff members. I know that there have been resource lists on the church website. What does it look like to pull resources together to help people continue their growth?
Yeah, I think, Eric, it goes back to, this is where I think there is real power and beauty in us being aligned with other churches who are doing similar work, some who are farther along than us. We're 22 years old, and there's certainly some churches who've been doing what we are trying to do longer than us. But there are also a lot that are around the same age or some younger. And so I spend a lot of time in conversations and in connection to other pastors to for us to sort of workshop what works and what doesn't work, learning best practices about how to do exactly what you're talking about. And it is all those things. It is experiences such as the anti-racism discipleship pathway. It is putting books and podcasts such as this one, and bringing in speakers and presenting opportunities for workshops. But there's also a very real opportunity that we keep putting before our people to just learn by doing. Like, because we could book study and book club ourselves to death talking about justice and caring for the community and getting to know the community, and nothing I think replaces just the real experience of coming into actual contact with people. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of people come to Sanctuary, because in their day-to-day lives they don't come in contact with North Minneapolis on their own. And being a part of Sanctuary is one of the ways that they can get to know the community and serve the community, be a blessing to the community. So we have this part of our ministry that's called neighboring, that really is our community ministry area. It is not like a arm of the church where the people who are very committed to being present in the community, you all go over there and that's your thing. The heart of neighboring, and this is something we're still growing in how we communicate it and how we implement it. The heart of neighboring is that it would be a pathway for all of the church to be involved in exactly what you're talking about. And so there, we realize that there are some people for whom, uh, like holding a conversation with a guy standing on the corner waiting on the bus, that's nothing for them because they themselves grew up in this neighborhood, and so they don't feel at all estranged talking to somebody waiting on the bus or whatever. Or if a guy comes by and he's stumbling and he smells like alcohol, there are people in our church for whom that doesn't scare them at all. They are perfectly fine going and having a conversation and checking on somebody, or redirecting a person if they're like acting out of character. And then there are others for whom like that is the scariest thing imaginable. And so I think some of the events that we do allows us to um, pair people who are like veterans of the work and people who are like newbies to the work, pair them up in some meaningful ways, give them a task to do, um, and you're learning in real time. And so right now we're preparing for Juneteenth festival, which will come up on the second Tuesday in June. That's one of two major events that we do in the community each summer. And so we'll host a stage out front. We'll have bouncy houses for kids. We'll have a prayer station. We'll hand out food and groceries. We'll do a bunch of other stuff for families. Just really allowing the community to be blessed, but also allowing our church to be alongside the community and experience it as well. And so we're signing volunteers up to be a part of that work. And we're telling people like, hey, if you volunteer for an hour or 2 hours, hang around for another hour and just experience it yourself. Because there's some stuff you will not learn from reading in a book. You'll actually learn it just by being like shoulder to shoulder with somebody. And I've seen incredible stories of in real time of people who like began and they were so afraid and so green and may have said something that was kind of wild and like just off-putting to somebody. I've seen those very same people, as they stay committed to the work and stay humble and teachable, I've seen some of those very same people become very skilled and very equipped um, to be in the community and serving in the community. We also have, and this will be the last thing I'll say about this part, we also have a huge number of our members in our church who work in the community in various capacities as teachers in schools and business owners and other small business owners and um, like they're they're here at our church because many of them they've seen already our commitment to the community, and they draw something from being able to worship in the community, have a church that they know is committed to that community, and then they're empowered to go back and do their day-to-day Monday through Friday work in a real way, like they are living out the mission of our church through their vocation day in and day out. And so Sanctuary has a huge presence here in North Minneapolis. And I think there's always a willingness to say, hey, if you are new to this, let's let's get you started somewhere, and let's take a growth approach to it. May feel hard right now, but we can learn a few things here. And then here's this other opportunity to do it a couple months later. Here's another opportunity here or there. And over time, you really do grow your muscles in being able to connect and engage in the community. So I think there's a place for everybody to do that work. So
Yeah, that's really interesting. For some of the things that I've been interacting with recently. So I recently interacted with Steve Eng, who's the advocacy director for the National Association of Evangelicals. And
yeah,
he, as part of that, was talking about how action can be a spiritual discipline. There are things that
right,
you cannot learn without putting
right,
them into practice. And so I think
right.
that your whole response there speaks to that. There are things that you cannot learn without actually putting them into practice.
Right. And there is, I think there's a rhythm, Eric, of you can learn some things in a book and in theory, you begin to put them into practice, you learn, like you're empowered to or inspired to learn more, then you go back and like there is this rhythm of learning and doing and learning by doing that I think we don't think about enough. It's either I'm just gonna do it without any sort of preparation and reflection of what I'm learning and what I'm becoming, or we're like, I'm just going to read every book I can on justice, and I never actually get around to practicing it. And I want us to weave those things together and learn by doing as well, and learn through failing. Like everybody's going to mess up. We've messed up a lot. Like we there I could give you a long list of programs that we started thinking it was going to be like a meaningful opportunity, and it was something that like the opportunity was for us to learn from the failure. um and so there is a real sense in which the idea of perfection and linear ministry and those things get thrown out the window when real people are involved. So
Yeah. Just looking at our time here, we'll have this be our last question.
awesome.
For uh, I know that you have some connections outside of Minnesota, just with the different things that you're involved with. For someone who's not in Minnesota, who do you see around the country who you feel like is also doing this work really well, or you could say like someone on social media who someone can follow and like sort of have as
Yeah.
a maybe a model for this is what this looks like in different parts of the country.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I have to, of course, shout out the two my two predecessors here at Sanctuary. So Dr. Efrem Smith and Dr. Dennis Edwards, both of them are not just practitioners of the work, but they're also both academics, and so they write and teach and train on this stuff all the time. And so I would say look up both of them, buy every book they've written. Pastor Dennis is now the dean of North Park Seminary in Chicago, our denomination's seminary. And if you ever have an opportunity to study under him and learn from him, it will richly bless your life. He's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. But he comes from like decades of both pastoring and the academy. And so he weaves it together beautifully. Um, I would also think of folks like Tyler Burns, who is a pastor in Pensacola that I've become good friends with. He has a podcast called Pass the Mic that him and Jemar Tisby do together, and they talk about these issues from a biblical perspective. And both of them have like they've done the work and they write and speak about the work, and they've taken their lumps for trying to call the church to this work. And so I would highly recommend the two of them. I think of trying to think who are some other folks, particularly sisters, that I would recommend. I think of Natasha Robinson, who writes. I think her book is Sojourner's Truth was one of her latest books. But Natasha Robinson, Sistrunk Robinson, I've known Natasha since seventh grade, and then reconnected with her like about 5-6 years ago in this work, and have learned a lot from her. I would encourage people to get connected to CCDA and the Christian Community Development Association. They've been doing this work for a very long time, and they equip and resource churches and individual Christians to do this work. I'm going to forget so many people. Eric, maybe I can shoot you a list of some others. I apologize to like friends of mine who are doing this work. Dominique Gilliard, who's in the Covenant and has written a bunch of stuff, rethinking incarceration and other things. He's incredible. Dr. Soong-Chan Rah, he's incredible. Oh man, yeah, I love that question, and I'm forgetting a bunch of people right now. But I would say there's a, regardless of where you live, I would assume there's somebody who's doing this work in some way. And so if not those names, just begin to, and I certainly mean this, pray for just people who would speak into your life in some of this work, who've written stuff and take advantage of what's out there. Like there's some of these brothers and sisters who've written many books. I would say, like invest the time in getting those resources and checking out podcasts they've spoken on and other things like that. And then when you get the opportunity to meet them, I think it makes that time even richer. So.
Yeah, definitely. I'll echo everyone you said.
Yeah.
all great people to learn from.
Yeah.
So, Pastor Edrin, thank you for joining me on this.
Yeah, man. I thank you again. Yeah, thank you again for having me, Eric. I'm excited to see where this venture goes. I know it's gonna be it'll be a lot of work, but it'll also help you to grow, and you're also making a huge investment in the kingdom, man. And so any way I can support you and help continue to get the word out, I am very happy to do that. So
for sure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.